Over the past year and a half, the war in Ukraine has apparently begun to turn into a war of attrition, which is generally more favorable to Russia, since it has much greater resources. For its part, new conflicts have begun to erupt in the world, such as the one that has now begun between Israel and Palestine. The United States also plays a decisive role there and has turned its attention to Israel. In such circumstances, the question arises: what will happen if Ukraine loses this war? How will the world and Ukraine change? It's worth noting that Ukraine's losing this war can be interpreted differently and can occur in a number of scenarios. Some will consider it a loss to maintain the status quo without returning the territories. Some will consider it a continuation of the endless war. And we can also consider the option of a second attempt at a large-scale Russian offensive on Kyiv with a successful outcome for Russia and a fatal outcome for Ukraine. In this video we take a global look at the worst-case scenario if Ukraine loses this war. The first consequence is the strengthening of Russia in the post-Soviet space and the threat of new conflicts. Obviously, if Russia wins this war, it will be able to strengthen its role in the post-Soviet space. Since the early 90s, Russia's role in the post-Soviet space has been extremely high. Russia was the main and largest country in the former Soviet Union, so it had a serious impact on literally every country in the former Soviet republics. This affected both the economic and the socio-political spheres. Russia had a serious reserve of soft power. In many countries, including Ukraine, Russia began to lose its influence in the 2000s. The Baltic states joined the European Union and NATO, and Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova also began to change their vector to the west. In the 2010s, Russia's position will continue to weaken. Central Asia will tilt toward China, Azerbaijan to Turkey, and the aforementioned countries will drift even to the west. However, a victory in Ukraine could strengthen Russia's regional influence. Many countries will simply be afraid of a similar scenario as in Ukraine, so they will follow the Kremlin's lead. In this situation, Moscow will put pressure on countries and blackmail them. In the worst-case scenario, new wars will begin in which Russia will be able to win. It should be understood that Ukraine is one of the largest post-Soviet countries, so winning over others will be much less of a problem. Globally, the United States may thus lose its weight in the post-Soviet space. This will weaken Europe and the NATO bloc, and Russia will satisfy its expansionist appetites when its sphere of influence includes at least a significant number of former Soviet republics. The second consequence is the issue of Taiwan and China. As you know, the issue of Taiwan has become more and more serious recently. The Chinese authorities are very determined. In turn, American generals are already predicting and preparing for a war in the next 5–10 years. Putin's success in Ukraine may show China that it can also work with Taiwan. Moreover, China is already watching the war in Ukraine, taking into account the mistakes made by both sides and understanding how the great wars of the new generation will be fought. Of course, an attack on Taiwan would be different because of the geography of the region, but China can gain useful experience here as well. In addition, the Russian side, having serious experience in conducting long and large-scale combat operations, can help China and, for example, through instructors, can share experience and even train Chinese soldiers. More broadly, a loss in Ukraine could weaken the United States' position in Asia. This could affect both China, with its claims to Taiwan, and the Korean Peninsula, with Kim Jong-un's ambitions to conquer all of Korea. Moreover, the latter is actively cooperating with Russia. Therefore, in the event of its victory, it could be rewarded for its help in the form of new technologies, which North Korea obviously does not have at the moment. In general, a war in Taiwan could happen before the end of the war in Ukraine, and vice versa, it could cause Ukraine's defeat. If a war breaks out in Taiwan, the United States will focus all its efforts on the defense of the island, and Ukraine may not be a priority in terms of supplies and transfer of resources. Despite the fact that Joe Biden recently states that there are enough resources for everyone, in reality, this is not the case, and the United States has a number of bottlenecks in the military production. For example, there is a shortage of 155mm shells even in Ukraine, and they will be actively needed in Taiwan. The United States will probably be able to find a way to ramp up production quickly if necessary, but the risks for Ukraine will remain high. The third consequence is a possible weakening of NATO and Europe as a whole. At the moment, it's difficult to estimate the actual probability of such an event, but it's quite possible. On the one hand, the war in Ukraine has caused the NATO bloc to expand once again to include Finland, and Sweden is expected to join soon. On the other hand, the above-mentioned risks will weaken the United States, and with it and the entire NATO. European countries will not be able to feel as secure in the future if Russia increases its power in the region. In a recent speech, Joe Biden himself said that if Ukraine loses, Putin will be able to attack the Baltic states and even Poland. Again, this is probably just populism and political manipulation, but one way or another, a Russian victory in Ukraine will not help the alliance and will put it in a more vulnerable position. The first consequence is the global problems in Ukraine if Russia gains a complete victory over it. That is, if Russia will control all or most of Ukraine's lands, we can accept mass repression and erasure of Ukrainian identity. This is already happening to some extent in the occupied territories, but it will spread to the rest of Ukraine. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, some may consider the endless war on its territory to be Ukraine's loss. Indeed, a state of constant war can simply destroy Ukraine's statehood as such. If the war drags on, the country's economy will be destroyed. The population will leave the region en masse, and Ukraine itself will simply turn into a disaster region. In general, in this scenario, Putin will achieve his goal. In one way or another, he will put Ukraine on the brink of survival and turn it into European Afghanistan, a zone of constant disaster, with no prospects and constant war. Such a scenario would obviously also be a loser for Ukraine and lead to irreversible consequences. Returning to international politics, we cannot but mention the Middle East region, which has recently become extremely hot again because of the war between Israel and Palestine. In case of Ukraine's defeat, Iran's position in the region may significantly strengthen, and then the country may directly participate in the war against Israel, which it has been trying to destroy for the first decade. Iran today is a strategically important ally of Russia and is already receiving Russian technology, such as a new aircraft. If Russia wins, Iran will gain an advantage in the region both at the expense of its military industry, which Iran has been building up recently, and at the expense of Russia itself, which will help Iran and through it strengthen its position in the region. Moreover, Russia will be able to return to Syria again with more serious forces after the war in Ukraine is over, strengthening the Assad regime and helping in Iran's confrontation with Israel. If Russia wins, it could force many countries in the Middle East and beyond to rethink their policies towards the West and join Russia. Indeed, in many regions there will be many such countries, even some of the allies of the United States in the Middle East. In general, we can say that the global security system may indeed collapse. To summarize, Ukraine's loss in this war could play a serious role at the global level. The United States will lose its role in world politics. Russia will strengthen its regional influence. and new tensions will likely arise in other parts of the world, and the United States will not be able to do anything about it. In this case, the most pessimistic scenarios were considered. If you liked the video, you can support our channel to continue making similar videos. All the details are in the description. Thank you.